So welcome to another video. This one's on chapter 19, the end part of chapter 19, and the main part of the video is actually on types of agriculture. In the end, we'll do fisheries, but a couple of classes didn't get to talk about the world grain carryover stock, which is something important to know. So I just wanted to quickly go over this. And basically, this is just the amount of kind of stored crops that we have as a world. And it's, as it says here, it's a measure of our food security. And it's kind of like, as I mentioned in some classes, it's kind of like the equivalent of, a household having a bunch of, canned foods or something in the basement. It's kind of our, in case of emergency, if for some reason we can't produce food. And it's been decreasing. You can see here it's been decreasing since 1987. The UN doesn't think that we should be below 70. We are now, under 70 days. So basically, if we could only use the food that was in this kind of store, that it would last 70 days for the human population. And the question is, why has this reduced? And what are kind of the driving forces behind it? And essentially, we're using grain for a lot more things now. And one of them being ethanol production. Also, we're feeding a lot of grain to feedstock, as you know, much more than what humans eat. And the increase in human population also, of course, plays a role in this too. So this is a big issue, and you kind of saw in the movie a little bit about, the conflict over our food supply. So that's why it's such a kind of a big deal, a big topic. Okay, so now on to the types of agriculture. So we've been talking a lot about industrial agriculture, which is shown here on the left, and what was discussed in the movie Food Inc. But there's also subsistence agriculture, which is done much more common in other countries and in villages all over the world. So there are many types. Okay, so the question is, what are these different types? Okay, so a lot of these you've heard before, or some of them you've heard before. Shifting cultivation is basically where you kind of shift. So the shifting part is you kind of move around in the cultivation. So you move your cultivated land around to different areas, and you kind of leave a certain area alone for a while and then come back to it after maybe 5 or 10 years. So you're not kind of exhausting the resources of one plot of land, just kind of continuously. You let it rest. And so the question for you is, what do you think the benefits are of this? And, to let it rest for a while, think of, the nutrients that would allow to return to the soil, and kind of the reestablishment of insect communities or fungal communities or bacterial communities that would enable kind of buildup of nutrients again. So that's really beneficial for shifting cultivation. And so what would the success of this technique be determined by? A lot of different things. You can think of, the type of land that you start off with, but also a really determining factor is how long you let it rest for, of course. Letting it rest for a year versus 10 years, you're obviously going to have a much more productive field if you let it rest for longer. But that's going to, based on the assumption that you have somewhere else to farm in the meantime. So there are a lot of considerations there. This one, as you might be able to guess, is slash and burn. And this is where you basically take down, it usually happens in the rainforest, and you cut down the rainforest and then you burn it, and then plant crops there. Okay, it's a type of shifting cultivation just because you kind of slash and burn and then move on to the next area once that land has been exhausted of its nutrients. But why do you think it might be less sustainable? Well, you're cutting down rainforest, first of all, as opposed to kind of shifting around previously used agricultural land. And quite often, these areas are planted with crops and used for agricultural purposes until all the nutrients are essentially used up, and then they might change it to kind of a ranch land or pasture. So it's not really done with sustainability in mind. They just kind of use it up and move on. Okay, pneumatic herding is also considered agriculture, a type of subsistence agriculture, because essentially you're, instead of raising plants, you're raising animals, and you're raising them on poor farming lands. So these herders are always moving around trying to find food for their animals. And the question, what types of landscapes would this be practiced most in? You can think, in these areas where it's poor farming land, maybe if it's very arid or dry in an area, arid and dry being the same kind of thing basically, you're not going to be able to plant that many crops, but there still might be some plants that are growing which livestock can eat. Okay, whether it's different weeds or grasses that we wouldn't eat, but the livestock can eat, so you can raise animals on land that may be not good for farming. Maybe the soil's not good quality, or it's salty or something, but you can still have animals eat whatever life is growing there. So that's that one. Oh, I forgot I had that. So why would they be practicing these types of landscapes? Well, just what I said, that it would be poor quality for growing our crops, but animals could eat those plants. Okay, and the last one we talked about when we did soil, and this is called intercropping, where you grow different types of crops at the same time in the same place. So you can see different crops here. You have wheat, and this is some sort of bean or legume. And the benefits of this, as we talked about, you get different nutrients into the soil, which is important for a sustainable crop over time. And you can think of the drawbacks in terms of your ability to harvest it quickly and efficiently. Obviously there are quick ways of doing this, but maybe not as kind of on a grand mass production scale as you guys saw in the movie with the corn harvest. And you're also obviously not getting as much of each crop, but you're getting 2 crops instead of 1, which is good. Okay, so now the question of all the environmental impacts. So the use of fossil fuels and pesticides definitely have a big impact. So they pollute the air and water, and this is a lot of what we're going to get into in the next couple of units. We haven't talked about air and water pollution, but fossil fuels and herbicides also, they get into the air or they run off into the water. And they're also going to, over time, decrease the soil quality and fertility. Anytime you have a chemical in the soil, it's not a fertilizer, but a pesticide, it's not going to be good long-term for the plants that grow there. Okay, and so aside from the pesticides and herbicides, you also have the runoff from the animal waste. They may remember the discussion of in the movie. And this pollutes water. It harms fisheries also, whether the fish are living in the ocean naturally or they're in aquaculture. And then the question of genetically modified organisms in the environment, there's some thought that this might contaminate natural food supplies, and that the breeding between natural organisms and GMOs may be problematic for the viability of the species down the road. There's a lot of uncertainty there, but it's certainly an issue to think about. And then the last one is with land degradation and habitat fragmentation. There are a lot of issues with that, which I'll get into in the next slide, but there are a lot of different ways to kind of treat the land. And so here they are. So land degradation is basically the idea that you kind of decrease the future ability of land to support the crops or livestock. So this is, the degrading basically of the quality of the soil and the water and stuff that we talked about. Habitat fragmentation, this gets back to, what was it, chapter 17 with endangered species, right? The threat to endangered species with habitat loss, because you're breaking up large areas of habitat kind of into these small isolated patches when you're doing agriculture and setting aside land for growing food. And then the issue of cultivating marginal lands, so cultivating lands that aren't really kind of ideal, or not even ideal, but just not very well suited for growing food. Whether you're irrigating dry lands and kind of taking too much water, then it naturally should be used in that area. You think of deserts, they don't have really water-needy plants growing there. They have cactuses and all the plants that are kind of water or drought tolerant, and that's important. But when you put plants there that need a lot of water, you're going to use more water than is provided in that area. And also cultivating land that's prone to erosion. So once you kind of break up the soil, you might have more erosion there, and you're gonna lose soil, which is not good. So how can we fix this? Okay, so we always want to think of, what can we actually do about this instead of just talking about all the bad stuff. So kind of the overarching theme is just to model after natural systems. And what does this mean? So plant many species of crops in one area, like the intercropping. Why? You increase species diversity, you get more nutrients in the soil, you get more insects that will compete with each other, so you won't get outbreaks of one particular species of insect. Crop rotation and conservation tillage, we talked about in the soil chapter with preserving the quality of the soil. Again, nutrient loads and variety of nutrients there are important. Plant legumes when you can, and if you guys remember, legumes are nitrogen fixers, so they'll increase the nitrogen content in the soil, which is important because nitrogen is often a limiting factor, a limiting nutrient for agriculture. And then this is kind of cool too. This is using natural predator-prey relationships instead of pesticides. And the question is why? What does this mean? So this is essentially where you bring in, by having many species, there are many different insects that have predator-prey relationships. So one insect eats another. And so you don't need to necessarily use as many pesticides because the bugs will be eating each other, like what happens kind of in natural systems. All the populations regulate each other. So there are many farmers that are starting to use a lot of these practices, and this practice of kind of using some of these sustainable ways, these methods, is called integrated pest management, or IPM. And I think it's important to think about with this and with other things is you don't have to do everything, or you don't have to necessarily not use any herbicides or pesticides, but this idea that you can do less pesticide use, so you can implement some of these practices to decrease your impact and make it a little bit more sustainable. A little bit definitely helps. The more you do, the better, but it's nice to see that some farmers are starting to use this more and more because they're seeing that it does increase their yield and their long-term effectiveness and productivity. So this handout we're going to be using tomorrow in class and looking at all the different solutions. So this kind of highlights all the different ways that you can improve the sustainability of your agricultural production. So I have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to keep going. Is there a single solution to all this? Well, no. And we'll talk about that in class a little bit. And just a little bit more on fisheries. We're going to see a little video on this in class. But just the challenges, the ocean, no nation lays claim to the open ocean. This is beyond the coast, but to the open ocean. So there's a tragedy of the commons issue where everybody kind of wants to take some. And so over-harvesting is a big problem. There are many species of fish are at the point of severe depletion. Cod, there's a huge decline in the cod fisheries decades ago. And there are other fish stocks that are in severe need of management action, which basically would mean putting limits to the catch that fishers can take. And here are a whole bunch of different ways of fishing. You can do it with nets, which is probably the most common, long lines, where you put out miles and miles of these lines in the ocean, which can be problematic because you can see turtles get in them too. And there's something called the Magnuson Fisheries Conservation Act, 1977, and this is what regulates the fisheries in the United States. So again, they put limits on the amount that that fishermen can go out and take out. So they have actual catch limits, which is good. Okay, so some problems with fisheries, the pollution. You can see the different sources of pollution, whether it's oil or runoff from cities actually affects the ocean too, and the fish that are growing there. Okay, 20 seconds. Aquaculture is where you basically farm in the sea. And you can see that there are many issues, problems with it that the movie will go into. But they can produce a lot of waste that pollutes the water systems and may hurt natural habitats. All right, thanks. I will see you in class.